Marek, welcome to MDrives and welcome to BMW M140. I'm owned by my friend Dom, who's sitting next to me. So thank you for giving me access to this car. As some probably noticed by now, this car was actually on my channel many times, but I never actually drove it. It's about the time that I'm gonna grab the wheel of this car and see how close this car actually is to my M2. So the idea today is to find out how this car behaves on the road and how it compares to my M2, how close the M-lite can be to the M2. So let's run quickly through some mechanical modifications of this M140. So it has Puma speed lowering springs, ultra racing front strut brace, spacers, genuine underbody brace and PowerFlex subframe bushes. It also has a hot climate air intake which delivers slightly more cold air to the engine. It also has BCN mid-pipe with dynamic drone eliminator and modified back box, which makes this car sound really good. Right, so there's only one way to find out how this car feels on the road. Let's drive it. I'm starting in the comfort mode because I want to find out how this car feels as a daily as well as a sports car. And so far it feels good. Obviously, because of the lowered springs, you can feel it follows the curvature of the road much more than a standard car would. But I'm really comfortable, and that's obviously thanks to the suspension, which can be tweaked and changed to the softer setting. And to be honest, maybe that's something I'm missing on my M2. But let's talk about this car. B58, 335 horsepower, 500 Newton meters. This is a standard engine, standard map. Nothing has been changed on it, so I'm going to experience the pure power of the standard B58 power plant. In terms of the seats, they are exactly the same as in my M2. Obviously I had M140i LCI before, so this interior feels almost identical. It's a pre-LCI model as well and pre-OPF model, so it gives much more noise as well than the newer M140s. However, at this point I need to tell you that the exhaust in this particular M140 has been modified. So it has BCS resonated mid-pipe, so both resonators were deleted. There is, however, a small resonator which stops the drone, because it's the version for the MPE, and the back box was actually modified as well. So this car will sound, as you hear in a moment, much better than a standard car. So cruising around town in this car, it's brilliant. I can see why Dominic picked this car over the M2 he had previously. So before, he had an M2 in manual like mine, OG, pre-LCI, and after having a fun with it for a season, he sold it and switched to this. And to be honest, I understand why, because he does quite a few miles every day, using it every day, going to work, so it does make sense. B58 is much more economical power plant, and obviously with the automatic gearbox it can deliver really good figures on your daily runs. I think it can easily achieve over 40 miles to the gallon when you stick to the limits. So yes, it's a much better daily than an M2. In terms of comfort, I think this car, it really shines because of its adaptive suspension. Even on lowering springs, this car feels so much softer and comfortable than my M2 with a standard suspension. And I'm sure stiffening the suspension, which we will try in a moment, will make a significant difference and will give you much more sporty feel. The gearbox, it's a ZF8 Auto. It's very efficient, it's reasonably fast. In town it keeps revs really low. I mean, we're cruising around town now and it keeps it about 1200 RPM, so that's where the economy comes from. It uses B58's low down torque to its full potential. So I'm going to switch to Sport Plus now. Even cruising in the second gear in town, you can actually hear it crackles a lot every time you lift off. It also sounds really good. I was always a bit biased because I had M140i. I always thought it sounded better than M140s. It's probably a bit more raw, a bit more raspy than B58 sound, which to me was a bit muted and synthetic. However, I think this one just shows you the potential. With the slight modification, B58 sounds absolutely brilliant. Right, so we're in Sport Plus, so we've got sport suspension, sport steering, and obviously sharp throttle. So let's find out how it accelerates. No doubt this car is fast, I can tell you that. It feels as fast as my M2, and that's obviously because of its torque and shorter gears of ZF Auto. However, what I can tell you straight away is that even in the hard setting, suspension feels still way plusher than the M2. It really is still much more comfortable. It doesn't feel so busy. It feels slightly more floaty, but it sits well on the road. I think around 4000 RPMs, this car feels even faster than my M2. Yeah, it's very close. It's either the same or faster, but it feels very punchy. So let's talk about suspension of this car. So it has lowered springs, then it has spacers, power flex bushes at the rear subframe, and it also has the underbody brace, which was installed by BMW on some early M140i's, but never on later M140s, especially with 5 doors. So the suspension feels really good. Even in its harder setting now, I feel it's softer than my stock suspension in M2, but it gives you enough feedback from the road and despite being slightly softer and more comfortable than mine, I feel a good confidence in it. In terms of the steering, this is where probably the biggest difference between both cars is apparent. So M2 has this granular feel when it comes to feeling through the steering wheel. You can feel the surface, you can feel exactly what car does, and when you turn it, when you even the slowest input, it feels like it's transferred to the road straight away and it moves the car. With this car, unfortunately, that isn't happening. It turns well, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't give you the same feedback. Yeah, it really accelerates well. So going back to the steering, it's just not as precise. It doesn't give you the same feedback as a full M car. However, it's not numb by any means. It still gives you enough. It still gives you a good feel of the car, just not as good as you would get in a full fat M car. The other difference between this and full M car is the diff. So as stock, this car comes with an open diff, and you can actually feel it. You can feel it doesn't give you the same feel when you're accelerating in second, third gear. I felt that a couple of times when changing a gear and accelerating. You can actually feel that the rear kind of moves slightly. You can definitely feel that one of the wheels is getting more power than another, and this is something I forgot how it feels actually since I've got M2. It's not something you will be missing if you never experience an M performance diff. But saying that, it can be easily fitted to this car. The only problem is it's expensive. They cost about £1,700-1,800, so it's not a cheap modification, but I think it's really worth it. If you are planning to mod your car, or you're planning to drive it really hard, I think you will appreciate it. Yep. So in a corner, I try to accelerate, and you definitely feel the lack of the diff. However, for some people, an open diff might be actually a safer option, because what the M Performance diff will give you in that situation, it will throw you sideways. This car won't do that, because you're spinning one wheel, it always has a bit more grip in the other wheel. However, if you have a closed diff, then when you provoke the car to lose the traction, it loses it in both wheels and goes sideways. The caveat to that is that it does it in a very progressive way. So actually, if you know what you're doing, it is very good. It's a nice feeling. You can throw the car around in the corners, do a nice power slides on the exit from the corners, and it's fun as long as you know how to do it. So I'm going to switch it back to comfort now, and yeah, we've got 1300 RPM, the car gone quieter, the suspension is now softer. It's actually really comfortable. It is a perfect daily, and I think that's how you can summarize this car. It's best of both worlds. You have a really comfortable car at your disposal every day. You can drive it to work, you can leave it in auto, I'm actually now doing 1100 RPMs at 45 miles per hour. So it gives you the full economy of the B58. But if you want to be a hooligan, Sport Plus, and it can do that as well. So let's quickly jump back to M2 and drive it back to back on the same road, just to see if I captured all the differences between the two. So I'm back in M2 and I'm going to try to replicate what I've done in the M140. So first I'm going to start in Comfort and then go to Sport Plus and see what the difference between the car is the most obvious. Obviously this is a manual, so it gives a different feel. The first noticeable difference is the suspension. I mean, it feels much easier than the M140 with modified suspension. There's nothing plush about the suspension in this car. Honestly, you feel like it's moving all the time. It also sounds much louder from the inside than the M140 in Comfort, that's for sure. Also, something to note, the M140 had a pan roof and it was slightly open, so it probably gave us a bit more sound that you would normally get if that would be completely closed. But in Comfort, obviously I'm a manual gearbox, so I'm in much higher revs. I'm doing 45 miles per hour now, and I'm already doing 1700 RPMs in a 6th gear. So as you can see, there's no way this car can be anywhere near as economical as M140 purely because of that. If you would have a 7 gear DCT gearbox here, obviously that would be a different story, but let's put that aside for now and let's focus on how fun this car can be. So switching to Sport Plus, obviously that sharpened the throttle. There's no change to the suspension because M2 doesn't have adaptive suspension. So as you can see, I'm moving a lot in my seat. It feels much harder, really much harder than the M140 with lowered springs in a sport setting. There's just no comparison, and I can see how this M140, even with the lowered suspension, is so much better as a daily driver. The second thing is the steering. I can feel straight away, even the slightest input gives me immediate reaction. The car turns straight away, while in an M140 it just feels a bit more rubbery, so it doesn't react as quickly. And keeping my hands on the steering wheel, I can feel through the steering wheel the imperfections of the road. So to me, that's a massive advantage, and that's something I really like about this car, and I was really missing in the M140. In terms of exhaust, it sounds completely different to B58, obviously, but it's a standard exhaust, no modifications at the moment, so you can definitely hear the crackles, but they are nowhere near as loud as they were in that M140. Obviously when you accelerate it feels much louder. I don't think it's much louder than that M140 was, but that's because it was modified. Stock M140 would not sound like this. So let's accelerate and see if there's any difference between both. I'm not sure, to be honest. It's very difficult to call it a win or lose. The only thing I can say is they accelerate in very similarly despite the differences. So obviously the M140 had shorter gears, M2 has longer gears because it's a manual. Therefore, I think that automatic M2 would be faster than M140. But because of the differences with the gearbox, I think they are pretty much the same. You see, and now this is where the M car shines really. Once you get to 60, that's where the suspension really starts working for you. I don't think this car was ever set up to do 30-40 miles per hour. It doesn't work, the suspension doesn't work at these speeds. On the bumpy B roads, because that's where we are, it just doesn't work. It's just busy, it moves all the time, it's not comfortable at all, and it doesn't really feel pleasant when you're driving at these speeds. It's just too busy, it doesn't give you anything. But once you get to 60, that's when it actually gives you all that feedback, and it smoothens all the curves in the road. So with the diff, this car gives me much more confidence when I'm accelerating in the corners. So the car moves, but it moves progressively. That's what I was talking about when I was in Dom's car. His car it gives you more grip, but when it snaps, it snaps. Obviously I didn't get to that point because I don't feel comfortable doing it in someone's car. But in my car, as you just saw, I was there in what, second, third gear, pushing in the corner. It started moving, the rear started moving, but it did it progressively, and you can catch it. You know when it's happening, and you can either let it go or you can simply slow down a bit to get the car into the line again. I think the last point I forgot to mention in Dom's car was how much quieter his car was compared to this. You could hear the engine, but it didn't have all that road noise which is present here pretty much all the time, especially on UK's B roads where the tarmac is really rough. Let's do a quick summary of what I've experienced today. Now, being back in M2, I can definitely feel that the steering, to me personally, it's night and day. It's something which I noticed when I first drove my car, when I bought it and went home. The first 100 meters I've done, I felt straight away the difference in the steering feel, and it's still there. It still feels a massive difference to me. Suspension, it's a big difference again, but I think M140 wins here if we're talking about daily driving. The car, it's so much more comfortable, it still gives you a good feedback. With the lower suspension, it feels almost perfect. This car feels perfect when I do 60. When I do less than 50, it just feels busy. It just doesn't feel as good. Unfortunately, M2 will never be a good daily driver unless you live in a city where the roads are good. Then obviously that's a different story, but we live in Yorkshire, lots of B roads here, and they are very uneven and rough, and unfortunately M2 is not a best car for this type of roads. The cabin noise is the other big one. Definitely a massive difference between both cars. This one, it's very difficult to listen to music in this one. When you're on the motorway, when you're on a B road, you really need to get with your volume at least 3/4 into the volume range to actually hear the music properly. It is actually impossible to have a telephone conversation over the car system when you're on a motorway or when you're doing over 50-60 miles on the roads like this. It's just too noisy in the cabin. In cabin comfort, it's very similar. You've got the same seats, so and the interior looks almost identical. The one big disadvantage of M2 is, and that's probably due to the suspension, it creaks a lot. Unfortunately, that's not something I experience in Dom's M140, nor I experience in my M135i over the years. So definitely M140 is a better all-round car. If you want a toy, pick M2, and I think this is probably the best summary of today. So thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope this was interesting and you enjoyed it. Please make sure you like it and subscribe to my channel, and I see you shortly in the next video. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Do widzenia.